Imagine a people so intimately connected to their horses that they learned to ride before they could walk, whose entire existence revolved around the rhythm of hooves on grass and the flight of arrows toward their prey. Imagine an army that could cover 100 miles in a single day, that could live off nothing but dried meat and mare's blood, that could cross frozen rivers in winter when no sane commander would campaign, and that could coordinate the movements of tens of thousands of horsemen across a front hundreds of miles wide, using nothing but smoke signals and couriers. This was the Mongol warrior, the master of the steppe, and in the 13th century he conquered the world. The name Mongol still evokes terror and wonder in equal measure. At their peak, they ruled the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from the Pacific coast of China to the gates of Vienna, from the frozen forests of Siberia to the sun-baked deserts of Persia. They destroyed ancient empires, sacked legendary cities, and reshaped the political landscape of Eurasia forever. And they did it with an army that never numbered more than 150,000 men at its greatest extent. An army of horsemen who seemed to appear from nowhere, strike like lightning, and vanish back into the grass. To understand the Mongol warrior, one must first understand the world that produced him. Before the rise of Temujin, later known as Genghis Khan, the Mongols were merely one among many Turkic and Mongol tribes living in the harsh environment of the steppe north of the Gobi Desert. These tent-dwelling horsemen had mostly entered recorded history as raiders and invaders threatening the towns and cities of northern China. The steppe tribes were constantly at war with one another. Tatars, Naimans, Merkits, Kerates, and Mongols, all fighting for pasture, for revenge, for dominance in an unforgiving land where survival itself was a daily battle. Into this chaos stepped a man who would change the world. Temujin, born in 1162 to a minor chieftain, endured a childhood of hardship and betrayal. His father was poisoned by Tatars when Temujin was only 9. His own tribe abandoned his family, leaving them to starve. He was captured and enslaved by rivals, escaped, and spent years fighting simply to survive. But through a combination of personal charisma, military genius, and ruthless determination, he began to unite the warring tribes. In 1206, a great council of Mongol chieftains recognized him as Genghis Khan, universal ruler, or Lord of the Earth. This unification was itself a revolution. Genghis Khan understood that the endless tribal feuds were a weakness, not a strength. He broke the old tribal structures, forcing soldiers from different clans to serve together in mixed units, creating new loyalties to the Khan rather than to ancient bloodlines. He promoted based on merit, not birth. His greatest general, Subutai, was the son of a blacksmith, yet became one of the most brilliant military commanders in all of history. He created a legal code, the Yasa, that imposed discipline and order on a people accustomed to none. And he redirected the martial energy of his warriors outward, transforming raiders into conquerors. The result was an army unlike any the world had ever seen. Every Mongol male between the ages of 14 and 60 was subject to military service. There was no separation between civilian and soldier. Every man was a warrior trained from childhood in the arts of war. The Mongol warrior lived his entire life in a close relationship with his horse. It was said that a Mongol boy learned to ride before he could walk, strapped to a horse by his mother, learning balance and control through sheer repetition. By the time he was 3, he could ride independently. By 5, he could manage a horse at full gallop. From his earliest years, he was taught the use of the composite bow, the weapon that would make the Mongols invincible. This bow, made of laminated horn, wood, and sinew was a masterpiece of engineering. The horn on the inner face resisted compression, the sinew on the outer face resisted tension, and the wood in between held it all together. The result was a bow small enough to use from horseback, typically about 5 feet in length, but with a draw weight of up to 165 pounds and an effective range of over 350 yards. A Mongol warrior could shoot an arrow with enough force to penetrate chainmail at 100 yards, and he could do it while riding at full gallop, turning in his saddle to shoot in any direction. The warrior typically carried 2 or 3 bows, each with a different purpose, one for long-range shooting, one for close combat. He carried 2 quivers containing at least 60 arrows of various types, light arrows with small points for long range, heavier shafts with broad heads for close work, armor-piercing arrows with hardened tips, whistling arrows for signaling, and incendiary arrows for setting fires. He kept files for sharpening his arrowheads, which were hardened by heating them red-hot and plunging them into brine. Beyond the bow, the Mongol warrior carried an arsenal of weapons. The lighter cavalry, who made up about 60% of the army, were primarily horse archers, relying on speed and missile fire. They carried javelins, and often a lasso for capturing enemies or stray horses. The heavier cavalry, the remaining 40%, wore armor and carried 12-foot lances for shock combat after the archers had disrupted the enemy. All warriors carried a curved saber or scimitar for close fighting, and many carried axes or maces as well. The mace was particularly effective against armored opponents, crushing bone and metal without needing to pierce. The armor of a Mongol warrior reflected his nomadic heritage. The light cavalryman typically wore a padded gambeson of felt or silk and carried a wicker shield covered in thick leather. In combat, he replaced his wool cap with a hardened leather or iron helmet, if available. The heavy cavalryman was far more protected, wearing lamellar armor made of small scales of iron, chainmail, or hard leather sewn together with leather thongs. This armor could weigh up to 10 kilograms if made of leather alone, more if metal scales were used. The leather was softened by boiling and coated in a crude lacquer made from pitch, which rendered it waterproof, essential for a warrior who might spend days or weeks in the saddle in all weather. Beneath his armor, the Mongol warrior wore a long, loose undershirt of raw silk. This seemingly simple garment served a vital purpose. If an arrow penetrated the outer armor, it would often fail to pierce the silk, instead carrying the resilient fiber with it into the wound. A field surgeon could then simply pull on the silk to extract the arrow, minimizing damage and reducing the risk of infection. It was a small innovation, but it saved countless lives. The horse was as important as the warrior himself. Each Mongol soldier typically maintained a string of 3 to 5 horses. These were not the massive destriers of European knights, but the tough, hardy Mongolian horses, relatively small but incredibly durable, able to survive on whatever forage they could find, to endure extremes of heat and cold, and to cover immense distances without tiring. By changing mounts frequently, a Mongol army could travel at high speed for days without stopping, covering up to 100 miles in a single day, a speed that left their enemies utterly baffled. These horses were more than transportation. They were comrades in arms. Horses ridden in battle were never killed for food. When old or lame, they were put out to pasture to live out their days. When a warrior died, his favorite mount was sometimes sacrificed and buried with him, ensuring he would have a companion in the afterlife. The bond between man and horse was absolute. On campaign, the Mongol warrior lived off the land and off his animals. His diet consisted primarily of dried meat and fermented mare's milk, supplemented by fresh blood tapped from a vein in his horse when necessary. This ability to sustain himself without supply trains gave the Mongols a mobility that no settled army could match. They carried minimal equipment, a sharpening stone for weapons, a needle and thread for repairs, a cooking pot, and perhaps a few personal items. Everything else could be found, taken, or done without. The Mongol army was organized on a decimal system that was both simple and devastatingly effective. The smallest unit was the arban, 10 men bound together by mutual responsibility. If one fled in battle, all 10 faced execution. 10 arbans formed a zone of 100 men. 10 zones formed a mingan of 1,000. 10 mingans formed a tumen of 10,000. From 2 to 5 tumens formed an army corps, or ordu, from which the word horde derives. Each unit had its own commander, appointed based on merit and loyalty, and transfers between units were forbidden, ensuring cohesion and mutual trust. This organization allowed extraordinary tactical flexibility. A Mongol army could advance on a broad front, with multiple tumens operating independently, but maintaining communication through a network of couriers and signal stations. When the enemy was located, information about his strength, position, and movements was relayed back to headquarters, and the forces converged for battle. Small units could harass and skirmish, larger units could envelop and destroy, and the whole army could coordinate complex maneuvers using flags, smoke signals, and the great war drums that gave the signal to charge. The tactics the Mongols employed were the product of centuries of steppe warfare, refined and perfected under Genghis and his successors. The classic Mongol battle began with a screen of light cavalry riding ahead of the main force to locate the enemy and assess his strength. Once contact was made, the main army would deploy in multiple lines, typically with heavy cavalry in the front 2 ranks and light cavalry behind, with outriders protecting the flanks. The engagement would begin with the light cavalry. They would ride forward in waves, loosing arrows at the enemy formation, then wheeling away before the enemy could respond. This was not indiscriminate shooting. The Mongols were skilled marksmen who could place arrows with deadly precision. They aimed for the horses of heavy cavalry, knowing that an unhorsed knight was helpless. They targeted officers and standard-bearers, disrupting command and control. They shot in volleys, creating a continuous rain of missiles that could demoralize and decimate even the most disciplined infantry. If the enemy held firm, the horse archers would continue their harassment, sometimes for hours or even days. If the enemy advanced, the Mongols would retreat, but it was a feigned retreat, designed to draw the enemy out of position and into a trap. The Mongols were masters of this tactic, able to simulate panic convincingly, then suddenly turn and counterattack when the pursuing enemy was strung out and vulnerable. Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who traveled through the Mongol Empire in the late 13th century, described these tactics with awe. When these Tartars come to engage in battle, they never mix with the enemy, but keep hovering about him, discharging their arrows first from one side and then from the other, occasionally pretending to fly, and during their flight, shooting arrows backwards at their pursuers, killing men and horses as if they were combating face to face. In this sort of warfare, the adversary imagines he has gained a victory, when in fact he has lost the battle. For the Tartars, observing the mischief they have done him, wheel about and make them prisoners in spite of their utmost exertions. Once the enemy was sufficiently weakened, his formations broken, his morale shattered, his cavalry decimated, the Mongols would deliver the final blow. The great war drums would sound, the signal flags would wave, and the heavy cavalry would charge. 12-foot lances came down. Thousands of horsemen thundered forward, and the enemy line, already reeling from hours of arrow fire, would simply disintegrate. The light cavalry would then pursue the fleeing survivors, cutting them down without mercy. The Mongols were not content merely to win battles. They sought to destroy armies completely, to leave no force that could rally and fight another day. This was war without quarter, war as annihilation, and it was made possible by a strategic mobility that no other army could match. The Mongols could appear where they were least expected, strike when they were least expected, and pursue until there was nothing left to pursue. Winter, for most medieval armies, was a time to huddle in camp and wait for spring. For the Mongols, it was the preferred season for campaigning. Frozen rivers became highways, allowing them to move rapidly across terrain that would be impassable in summer. The cold weather did not trouble men who had grown up on the steppe, and their hardy horses could forage through snow for grass. When the Mongols invaded Russia in the 1230s and 1240s, they struck in winter, catching the Russian principalities completely off guard. The first great wave of conquest began in 1211, when Genghis Khan invaded northern China. The Jurchen Jin dynasty, which ruled from Beijing, fielded massive armies and possessed formidable fortifications. But they had never faced an enemy like the Mongols. City after city fell. Beijing itself was captured in 1215. The Mongols, initially ignorant of siege warfare, quickly learned from their Chinese enemies, incorporating captured engineers and siege technicians into their forces. By the time they were done, they possessed a siege train that could reduce any fortification. In 1218, the Mongols turned west. The Khwarezmian Empire, which ruled Persia and Central Asia, was one of the great powers of the Islamic world. Its Shah, Muhammad II, controlled vast territories and fielded enormous armies. But he made the fatal mistake of executing Mongol envoys and merchants, an insult Genghis could not ignore. The campaign that followed was one of the most devastating in history. City after city fell: Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench. The Mongols slaughtered millions, destroyed ancient centers of civilization, and left such piles of skulls that travelers reported seeing them decades later. The Khwarezmian Empire simply ceased to exist. Genghis Khan died in 1227, but the conquest continued. His successors divided the empire, but they shared his vision of world domination. In the 1230s and 1240s, Mongol armies under Genghis's grandson Batu and the great general Subutai swept into Europe. They smashed the Russian principalities, sacking Moscow in 1238 and Kiev in 1240. A European traveler who visited Kiev 5 years later found an enormous number of skulls and bones of slaughtered men lying on the plain, and barely 200 houses standing. In 1241, the Mongols struck Poland and Hungary. At the Battle of Liegnitz, a Mongol army destroyed a combined force of Poles, Germans, and Teutonic knights. At the Battle of Mohi, they annihilated the Hungarian army under King Bela IV. The heavily armored knights of Europe, trained for individual combat and slow-moving frontal charges, proved utterly incapable of coping with the speed, mobility, and tactical sophistication of the Mongol horsemen. Nothing stood between the Mongols and the conquest of Western Europe, and then, miraculously, they withdrew. The news arrived that the great Khan Ogedei had died, and the Mongol princes were required to return to the capital to elect his successor. Subutai, the master strategist, reluctantly ordered his armies to turn back. Europe was spared. The Mongols would never again advance so far west. The empire the Mongols built was not merely a machine of destruction. Under the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, trade flourished across Eurasia as never before. The Silk Road, long disrupted by war and instability, became a highway for merchants, missionaries, and travelers. Marco Polo made his famous journey to China during this period, traveling under Mongol protection. Technologies, ideas, and goods flowed freely between East and West. Gunpowder, printing, paper money, medical knowledge, artistic styles. The Mongols, for all their ferocity in war, proved remarkably tolerant rulers. Genghis Khan had decreed freedom of religion for all his subjects, and his successors largely honored this principle. Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, and Taoists all practiced their faiths openly in the Mongol Empire. The Mongols themselves continued to follow their shamanic traditions, but they patronized temples, mosques, and churches, and they welcomed holy men of all faiths to their courts. This religious tolerance was not mere benevolence, it was good policy. The Mongol Empire encompassed dozens of peoples, scores of languages, and countless customs. To impose a single faith would have invited rebellion. By allowing each people to worship as they pleased, the Mongols bought loyalty and reduced resistance. It was one of many ways in which their practical, pragmatic approach to empire building set them apart from other conquerors. Yet the empire was not without its internal tensions. The Mongol system of succession was notoriously unstable. Each great Khan's death sparked a struggle among his descendants that could tear the empire apart. By the 1260s, the empire had fractured into four major khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China under Kublai Khan, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in Russia. They remained Mongol, but they increasingly went their own ways. In China, Kublai Khan completed the conquest of the Song dynasty, unifying China for the first time in 3 centuries. He established his capital at Beijing, which he called Khanbalik, and ruled as both Mongol Khan and Chinese emperor. His court was a cosmopolitan center where Persian astronomers, Tibetan monks, and Venetian merchants mingled with Chinese scholars. But the Mongol elite remained separate from their Chinese subjects, and resentment simmered beneath the surface. In Persia, the Ilkhans converted to Islam and became part of the Islamic world they had conquered. They built mosques, patronized Persian literature, and ruled as Persian kings. But Mongol rule in the Middle East was never secure. They faced constant resistance from the Mamluks of Egypt, who defeated them in battle and blocked their expansion into Syria and Palestine. In Russia, the Golden Horde ruled for more than 2 centuries, extracting tribute from the Russian princes and shaping the development of the Russian state. Moscow rose to prominence as the chief tax collector for the Mongols, learning the arts of autocratic rule from their masters. When Mongol power finally declined, the princes of Moscow were well positioned to inherit their legacy. The decline of the Mongol Empire was gradual but inexorable. Internal divisions, economic pressures, and the sheer difficulty of governing such a vast realm all took their toll. The Black Death, sweeping along the trade routes the Mongols had opened, depopulated cities and disrupted economies. By the mid-14th century, the empire was in terminal decline. The Yuan dynasty fell to the Ming in 1368. The Ilkhanate collapsed decades earlier. The Chagatai Khanate fragmented. The Golden Horde lingered until the 15th century, but never regained its former power. The Mongol warrior himself passed into history, but his legacy endured. He had reshaped the world. He had brought China and Persia into direct contact for the first time. He had opened Eurasia to trade and exchange on an unprecedented scale. He had demonstrated that mobility, discipline, and tactical brilliance could overcome any advantage of numbers or technology. And he had created an empire that, even in its ruins, continued to inspire awe and terror. What made the Mongol warrior so effective was not any single quality, but the combination of many. He was tough beyond belief, able to endure hardship that would break any other soldier. He was skilled in the saddle and with the bow, trained from childhood in the arts of war. He was part of a disciplined, organized military machine that could execute complex maneuvers with precision. He was led by brilliant commanders who understood strategy and tactics better than any of their contemporaries. And he was motivated by the vision of a man, Genghis Khan, who convinced his people that they were destined to rule the world. The Mongol warrior was not invincible. He could be defeated by well-led, well-disciplined armies that refused to panic, that held their formations, that denied him the opportunity to use his mobility and his arrows. The Mamluks did it at Ain Jalut in 1260. The Japanese did it when typhoons, the kamikaze or divine winds, destroyed Mongol invasion fleets. The Vietnamese did it in the jungles of Annam. But these defeats were the exceptions, not the rule. For most of the 13th century, against most opponents, the Mongol warrior was simply unstoppable. Today, the memory of the Mongol warrior lives on. In Mongolia, Genghis Khan is celebrated as the father of the nation, his image on currency, his statues in every town. In the lands he conquered, his name is still spoken with a mixture of awe and resentment, a reminder of the time when horsemen from the east swept through the world and changed it forever. And in the imagination of the West, the Mongol remains what he always was, the ultimate nomad, the perfect horseman, the warrior who conquered the world. The Mongol warrior was born in the saddle, raised on the steppe, and forged in the fire of constant warfare. He lived a life of incredible hardship and incredible freedom. He asked no quarter and gave none. He rode farther, fought harder, and conquered more than any warrior before or since. He was the master of the steppe, and for one brief, terrible century, he was the master of the world.